Moving your character through the grass in Tunic has this really satisfying behavior, but why does it actually behave like that and how can we replicate it? So I came into Blender and built this little thing that I'm calling a pointy bush. And I've inserted some components and metadata that I'll use inside of my game engine, Bevy, when we actually end up coding the effect. Also note that it's particularly relevant that all of the geometry is above the origin here. So when we actually do a rotation, this will end up rotating at the bottom point. And popping over to the actual game here, we've got a capsule with a collider. We've got our spawned in little piece of blade of grass, only one of them for now. We can see the sphere collider on that blade of grass. And we've got two interesting vectors. One is from the capsule to the blade of grass, and one is outward from the blade of grass. And our goal is to get an axis that we can do a rotation around. So if we take the cross product of this directional vector from our capsule to the blade of grass, and a vector like vec3y, so just a vertical vector, then we'll get a perpendicular vector, which is a vector that has a 90-degree angle between it and our original vector. But once we have that vector, we can actually use the distance from the capsule to the blade of grass to determine how far we should rotate it around this vector. And with a larger scene, we could see how this capsule can move through a field of grass and have the same effect, with all of the colliders turned on, all the debug visualizations. And turning off the visualizations gives us something that looks kind of nice. And once we've got the math down, the code for this is relatively straightforward. I'm using the Bevy game engine with the avian physics library. Colliding entities will give me any entity in the game that is currently colliding with that sphere collider. And collider of will give me the rigid body that is the parent of this collider. Then we're always looking for global transforms, so their positions in the world. Here we can see the math taking the translation of a player in world space and taking the distance to the grass. I was calling these bushes when I was building the example, so all the variables are named bush. I left the max distance sort of configurable. So we clamp this between 0 and the max distance, and then we remap that from 0 to max distance to 0 to 1, which allows us to sample from our rotation curve or use the value as a 0 to 1 linear value. Our perpendicular vector is exactly what I said before. It's the player position minus the grass position. We zero out the y-axis, so we end up with the vertical axis being 0 and the xz being on the plane. And we take the cross product with the y-axis that we just zeroed out, so 0, 1, 0. And that gives us that perpendicular vector that we were talking about. Given the angle that we're supposed to rotate around that vector and the vector, we can create a quaternion. Usually this is called from axis angle or some other similar name in your library of choice. I know there's a similar function in Unity and other packages. So get the distance to the grass blade, get that perpendicular vector using the cross product, rotate around that new vector. And that's the entire effect.